Hello and welcome to What's the World Coming To? My name is Pastor Ken Ortize, and each week on this podcast, I like to take a look at events that are taking place in the world and see if there is some correlation between what the Bible said would be the indicators that we are living in the last times. And obviously, you dedicate a whole podcast to that because you believe there's a lot of stuff going on in the world that seems to line up with the Bible said things would be like in the last days. And that's why when I come across interesting articles, my mind tends to take me to places that maybe other people don't go. In fact, I think this one might fit into that category because it's regarding basically the epitaph or eulogy of a very famous scientist, somebody who had a profound impact upon my young life and shaped my worldview before I became a Christian, and maybe in some ways actually contributed to my openness to the gospel because he essentially said the world was coming to an end as we knew it. Paul R. Ehrlich, an eminent ecologist and population scientist whose best-selling book, The Population Bomb, celebrated as a prescient warning of a coming age of food shortages and famine, but later criticized by conservatives and academic rivals, making them sound like they're the bad guys, for what they called its sky is falling rhetoric. He died on Friday in Palo Alto, California. He was 93 years of age. That in itself is quite notable because Dr. Ehrlich had promised basically that within 20 years of his writing the book back in 1968 or 67, that the United States would pretty much come to an end and the average life expectancy would be 44 years of life. But what's really fascinating to me, because we often make jokes about weathermen who tell us what the future is going to be in terms of weather for that day or even that week, and we find at least 50% of the time, if not higher, they're inaccurate. And the reason they're inaccurate is because weather is very dynamic. It can make changes that nobody can predict and usually don't do pretty well. I mean, we do exceptionally well today is what I'm trying to say, but in predicting what the weather patterns are coming, but they're often not exactly correct. And so the same thing is when you try to make futuristic predictions, there are so many dynamics that are in play that those predictions should always be made cautiously and not with the kind of certainty that comes out of the left-wing alarmist ecological climate change agenda. We just have to begin to have a certain degree of skepticism when we hear some of their predictions. But let me give you an example of just 10 of Dr. Ehrlich's prediction. Oh, before I do that, let me go on to explain. I made the comment that it had a great impact on my life. Well, I was a 19-year-old junior at the University of California at Berkeley, and I read this book, The Population Bomb, and it was so shocking to me. And because it was written by an eminent scientist, I was certain that what he was saying was probably true. And I began to operate on the premise that I wasn't going to grow very old, that I would die very early in life. And I think that helped me in some ways. I'm thankful for that. It made me begin to realize that life was short, and at 19, you don't really think about yourself having a short life and how short it really actually is going to be. But this really kind of shocked me, and I began to really go on a spiritual journey, which ultimately led me to faith in Christ. But some of the things that he predicted, I always also mentioned, he said that in the 1970s and the 1980s, which at that time seemed far away to me, he said there would be mass starvation. He said, quote unquote, hundreds of millions are going to starve to death in the 1970s. And he went on to suggest it's just baked into the reality. It's too late. We've gone too far. It can't be prevented. We can't escape from it. Well, what actually happened was there were no global famines in the United States of any kind of scale near that. And part of the reason was that food production had increased dramatically. It's what's called in the agricultural world the Green Revolution. There was so many advances in how to farm and to keep food that basically it made that not only the production but the preservation of food and then therefore the distribution of food much more effective. He also said, secondly, that the population would soon outstrip the food supply. that he said there would be catastrophic food shortages around the world. But the fact of the matter is, food production spiked in the 70s and the 80s again, so that the calories per person in most regions of the world went up dramatically rather than going down. He said that U.S. life expectancy, as I mentioned before, he said by 1980, the average life expectancy for American would be 42 years. Today it's 73 and has never been even close to 42 years. So I mean, it was wildly wrong in his prediction. He said that resources like gas and oil and even the metals that we use and all those things would quickly run out, that we would exhaust our supply. And we've heard that for years, that we're going to run out of oil. We need to find alternative sources of energy. But yet, not only have we found that there's massive deposits of oil and gas around the world, but there are also even rare metals that are readily available, even here in the United States, which haven't been accessed because of the environmental laws that people like Ehrlich pushed to restrict us from being able to extract those metals. In other words, taking federal lands, putting them aside, and not allowing any kind of mining or exploration to be done on them, even though it's great to have laws that mean they have to restore the land to the similar condition before they begin to excavate. But the whole point is they wouldn't even take that chance. The very idea of mining was considered to be something that was terrible, despite the fact that many new technologies have even made coal burning plants extremely clean, unlike the ones that are all over China, who somehow have avoided these same restrictions. It's interesting because he said England would not exist as a country by the year 2000. They would face a complete collapse of population. I mean, it would be depopulated. You'd go to London and there'd be nobody there. In fact, there would be so many nobodies there that would be no way to get to London to see that nobody was there. In fact, that hardly is the case. London is facing quite the opposite problem right now. And he said, sixthly, that India was doomed to live in a cycle of permanent famine. But today, India actually provides all of its own food. Yeah, they had some problems in the past, but today they're very productive and they're able to feed their population based upon their own self-sufficiency in agriculture and in the storing and preserving and distribution of foods once again. So again, the idea that things were going to fall apart were really wildly off the mark. He also said, number 7, that there would be a battle to feed humanity. In other words, their global famine would lead imminently to warfare amongst countries, that the whole world be inflamed by wars because people were trying to escape hunger. And what we find is, again, because there wasn't any global hunger and because there are hegemonic powers like the United States, those global warfares have not taken place. And the global system is not even close to collapsing. We find that goods are being shipped all around the world. The only thing that restricts them are the same kind of laws that came as a result of this kind of fear mongering. Then in number 8, he said there will be global cooling. Isn't that a surprise? He said that in 1960, he predicted that the Earth could enter a period of deep cooling, possibly leading to crop failures and food shortages. Well, one of the things we know is if the temperatures go down, then the planting and harvesting seasons become shortened, productivity comes off, and it does cause a shortage of foods. But we haven't experienced, in fact, what have we been hearing for the last 20 years about global warming? And that's because by 1995, the temperatures on Earth had gone up higher than they had been in the previous decades, but they've also started to come down in the following decades. So it hit a high and now it's going down, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. They said, number 9, that urban overcrowding would create a disastrous cities. The cities would become unmanageable due to the population density, which is kind of ironic, because some of the most densely populated cities in the world are also amongst some of the most wealthy and prosperous. And the reason why they're so prosperous is because they've learned to manage population density, and they've also created a market where you have more people buying more goods, which means that more money can circulate within the economy so that more people can buy more goods. It's the complete opposite. Now, take in mind that people like Ehrlich weren't economists. They didn't even understand the science of their own period enough to be able to make these kind of predictions, but that didn't keep them from making a living and a career on predicting the collapse of the world. And then, of course, number 10, he said, resource wars and global conflicts, nations will be fighting over food and raw materials, wars that were being driven by scarcity, were expected to increase dramatically. And so it is in the light of these predictions that he made certain recommendations. And there are recommendations which the United States, up until recently, most Western democracies like Britain and France and Germany and Scandinavia, the Netherlands and Switzerland and so forth, have all subscribed to their own economic hurt, along with the European Union, the United Nations, the World Economic Forum. But all of these kind of signed off on these predictions or these recommendations that Ehrlich and his like were promoting. And he said, number one, there's a necessity that we control population growth. And he recommended all sorts of measures, basically compulsory population control policies, things like abortion, and euthanasia, and even forced sterilization, things which have actually been applied. Even the ideas, it was recommended by Bill Gates and others, that they put sterilization drugs inside of the vaccinations without letting people know, so that basically they would be able to produce more kids. But the bottom line is, whatever you can do to shrink the population will extend the life expectancy of planet Earth and the survivors who are living on it. But it's interesting because that's one of the reasons why the Rockefeller Foundation in 1973 pushed President Nixon to promote the idea of making abortion legal. They've stated in their own documents that that's one of the ways that we can control the population. And what do you know? That's actually worked, because now we are at such slow population growth in the United States, we aren't even able to replace our own citizens. And that's why it was decided that the answer is to import millions from other third world countries. Not a very well thought through plan, but nonetheless coming out of the same intellectual grid, the same way of thinking, this same worldview, if you will. The second thing he said is we just need to reduce our quality of life. He said you shouldn't allow urban sprawl. You should have restricted areas like the UN has recommended in their policies, the World Economic Forum, and also many state governments. We have it here in our state that you can't, build on certain areas anymore. You have to build high density. So we have high density housing coming in, because the idea is we need to not use up or consume plantable ground and open space and cut down trees and so forth. Although in reality, we have plenty of space to do just about anything we want. And yet suddenly it's this lens that's everything's being viewed through, which is the idea of restricting control. And these people are very evangelistic about it. They believe that they are saving the planet by taking away your freedom of choice and your freedom of property. That's why they promote public transportation. I think in my own city, we have electric buses that nobody takes. I mean, you'll see a bus that costs, $1 million, and it has 3 riders in it, because most people still prefer to drive their own car. And so you realize that even push for electric transportation, not just public transportation, but electric transportation has been pushed forward and funded largely with government funds in order to meet the needs of the future, which is to eliminate pollution and create a safer environment, and also to reduce our carbon footprint, even though the carbon footprint from making an electric car is 100 times greater than making a gasoline-driven car. I mean, it's so nonsensical, and yet nonetheless, it becomes basically the rationale. It becomes the morality of the day. And then he even said that we need to start rationing food, limiting how many calories a day the average person can eat. Well, you realize that when you look at this, it's kind of like the idea of basically a socialist economy. You're centralizing everything, because the only way you can control people to this degree is to create a socialist, Marxist, top-down kind of government, which becomes mother government that runs everything and controls everything. And we are just supposed to submit to it because they're doing it for our own good. And again, I find that there's people who are really enthusiastic about these ideas, and they really sincerely believe that they are saving the planet, they're saving humanity, they're doing the best thing that can be done. and yet they aren't really thinking logically about it. In fact, it's created a lot of what I call the prepper mentality, where people are hunkering down and basically they're storing up food and buying all these different things, to ensure that when everything falls apart and goes down, they're going to be able to survive. At least their family and their genetic pool will extend off into the future. The point is, if it ever came to that, it would be like craziness. People would be preying on each other with a ferocity that's hard to imagine. But the whole point is that none of that is necessary. None of that is required. I think when COVID came, and it was really interesting how people thought, but all of a sudden people are so terrified that they weren't going to have toilet paper. Probably somebody put it on the internet, make sure you got enough toilet paper. I knew people who had a garage full of toilet paper. I mean, basically every day they would go first thing in the morning to Costco and buy their 2 packages of toilet paper. And I remember one day walking into Costco's, and we were going down there, and there's no toilet paper. There's no hand towels. There's nothing. It's all gone. I mean, pallets and pallets were gone because people were panic buying, because somebody along the line put out a meme probably and said, "What are you going to do when you can't wipe your own bottom?" So it's really how that irrationality takes over, because what the preppers are basically saying is that the battle to feed humanity is over. We're going to lose, and we need to get ready. And I think even I was watching on Angel Network where they have a whole series about these survivalists, and my wife and I we gave it a shot. I apologize. We couldn't make it through one episode. It just was like, oh, it's not really that enjoyable. But nonetheless, sorry to say that. But I think that what's really important for us to realize that the opposite is our problem. The problem isn't overpopulation. Our problem is underpopulation. In fact, Stephen Mosher is the president of Population Research Institute, said the following. He said, fertility rates have plummeted worldwide over the past 6 decades, leading to experts warning of dire consequences as the downward trend continues. He said continued low fertility rates will cause gradual implosion of the world's economy as the population ages and dies. In other words, it's kind of like a family. If you have one kid, you have a kid who basically thinks the world revolves around him. If you have 2 kids, you have a family where the 2 kids are constantly competing between each other for mom and dad's most favored status. But if you have a family of 12 kids, do you realize that you have this multi-generational kind of combination of kids who basically feed off one another, learn how to get along with one another, learn how to really kind of care for and appreciate and value one another? And interestingly, on average, their IQs are much higher than kids who grow up in a single family home, because they have a broader experience of relationships and communication. And they develop a very strong work ethic because they have to help out, because there's just too many faces to feed and things that need to be taken care of. So it's really kind of interesting, because generally larger families are healthier families, and smaller families create more narcissistic personality types. But I mean, it's interesting because nevertheless, even though the concern is that our populations are dropping in number and around the world, the only place that's growing in population numbers is in Africa, but everywhere else it's dropping pretty precipitously. And nevertheless, the World Economic Forum or the United Nations, and the United Nations particularly with their climate models, the IPCC, basically they study population control around the world and population growth, something that was created in the 1970s in relationship to Dr. Ehrlich's work and his predictions and his basically terrorizing. And essentially what they're still working to control the growth of population, even though the population is going downhill. And you'd say, well, why would they do that? It's kind of counterintuitive. Well, if you make widgets, you don't want to stop selling widgets, because that's how you make your living. Even though people are tired of widgets and don't have a place or use for widgets, you're still trying to make a market and produce it. Especially if it's a government-funded institution, you want to maintain your place in the pecking order and in the world. And so the people who are most worried about losing their income are the people who make an income off of selling false information, fake news. And that's not something new. That's been going on since the beginning of time. But what we find is that The consequences of a declining population is the result of much of our own actions. Part of the issue is that people putting off marrying and having kids, because young women in particular are told that they need to experience their career life before they experience a parenting life, and they push the level of fertility to the maximum, and suddenly their clock is ticking, and in many cases the clock no longer ticks, and they can't produce children. We think that there may be some environmental factors, in fact, in terms of our food supply and production and so forth, that may be contributing to the drop in fertility. But one thing we know certainly has limited the population of the United States and around the world is that 73 million babies are aborted every year. Here in the United States, think about it, 2,300 babies are aborted and killed every day. And so you realize that you're cutting into the growth of your population. So as you have people aging out of the child production level, and you have people who are killing their babies before they can ever get close to reaching maturity, you find that you're just going to have fewer and fewer kids. So it's becoming increasingly rare to see families of 3 or 4 or 6 kids, much less 12, like it was when I was a kid. So basically, worldwide, even though there's growth in Africa, worldwide, the average population of the world is declining by 4% per year. 4% a year in world population. And it's really interesting because I really believe that this whole focus is really demonic. It really comes from the devil. It's because God loves kids. In fact, one of the things he tells us repeatedly in the book of Genesis, be fruitful, multiply, bring forth abundantly, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over it, that you may be an assembly of people, a nation and a company of nations. God's plan was to populate the earth, and he created the earth with a capacity to support an ever-growing population. And yet, that's the one thing that Satan hates. He hates anything that God loves. God loves kids. God loves families. God loves marriage. And he hates all of those things and is doing everything he can to destroy them. And that's why we read, for example, in Psalm 127, in verses 3 through 5, he says, "Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is a reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of his youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them." Do you know how many arrows can be held in a quiver? 14. He says, happy is the man who has 14 kids. Well, most people I hear, if they've had more than 2, sometimes not even more than 1, are stressed and unhappy because they're saying, how can I afford to feed and care for these kids? And look at the cost of college and blah, blah, blah. So that they put a numeric value on their children. In fact, they offer us that every year. They can give us a numeric value. It costs you $235,000 to birth this kid and put them through school and get them out on their own. And many parents are finding them after they come back from college, they still don't have a usable skill and are living at home working at Chick-fil-A. What can I say? But in Psalm 128, he says, your wife shall be a fruitful vine. Your children will be like olive plants around your table. Behold, thus shall be the man he blessed who fears the Lord. That's the blessing of God. In fact, we find in Genesis 33:5 that Jacob makes that statement. He says, the children whom God has graciously given your servant. He had 12 kids. And he said, God, you've graciously given me all these children. Or in Deuteronomy 7:13, it says, he will love you and bless you and multiply you and the fruit of your womb. Now, one of the things that, and the reason I really hit on this with Dr. Ehrlich, because I think he really fathered this whole concept of the population doom and the decline and extinction of humanity and so forth. And even as his predictions proved to be inaccurate, wildly incorrect, just as Thomas Malthus in 1798 predicted that England would be depopulated within 20 years because they wouldn't be able to feed their population, and he was proved wildly wrong. So this goes way back, and yet they keep on doing this, and that brings us into the modern era where we find suddenly we're going from global cooling and starvation to global warming and getting fried to death and everything dying and becoming a desert. Again, nothing that's happened like that. during that same period, we find that not only is the Sahara Desert shrinking because there is more rainfall in that portions of Africa, so the desert is actually getting smaller, but also we find that the bigger problem is that the temperatures are warming many places around the globe in a very temperate way. They're causing more greening, which causes more carbon, more oxygen production, and plants rely upon carbon dioxide. That's why in greenhouses they pump fuel from gas-powered engines into that to create the exhaust, so there'll be more carbon to cause the plants to grow faster. So God created this perfect system where, carbon goes into the plant creates oxygen, and as it creates oxygen, everybody else, because oxygenation, the more oxygen tends to cause us to be healthier and stronger and more productive, which creates more carbon, because you're carbon and you produce carbon, and that goes back into the system. It just goes through this perfect cycle that God created that enables us to thrive on the planet. And basically, they're proposing a system that goes against that. Recently, they dumped this red chemical up in the North Sea to see how it would slow global warming, which is kind of insane because we already know that global warming isn't really a problem, that the temperature tends to go up and it tends to go down. So where did that mindset come from? Well, there came a guy by the name of Michael Mann in the early 90s who was a climatologist, and he basically created this chart, which they called the hockey stick, and basically said that Earth's temperature has been stable for 500 years to 1,000 years, and then all of a sudden over the last 10 years it just spiked up, and if it keeps on going, we're going to all die of heat exposure. And there was another guy that, another climatologist from Canada, Tim Ball, who basically challenged that. And he says, I've done the studies, I've run them over and over again. I cannot get anything close to what he's come up with. I find the temperature goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down within those same time frames, provable evidence that's been shown to be true. And he says, I've written to Dr. Mann and I've asked him to give me his data so that I can run it for myself, because if he did it based on data, then he should be able to show me the data and I should be able to get the same results. And Mann would not give him the data. So he was speaking in Pennsylvania, and somebody asked him about what he thought about Michael Mann's theory, and he said, well, I know that he teaches at Penn State, but I think he should be probably put into the state pen because he's a fraud. And you know what Dr. Mann did? He sued him for libel. Well, that's really interesting because, you see, because Dr. Ball was a Canadian citizen, he had to sue him in a Canadian court. And one of the differences between the Canadian courts and the U.S. courts is in Canada, if you file a suit against somebody who has accused you of fraud, you have to produce your data to show that it was a fraud. That's not required in the United States. You don't have to give up your data. That's proprietary. It's your personal property. They can't have it. And so basically, by filing it in Canada, he was required to produce the data that he said his hockey stick prediction was based upon. And you know what he did? He dropped the suit, which should tell you everything you need to know. Because a lot of this stuff has monetary incentives for people involved in powerful places, especially in the electronic solar energy industry and things of that nature, who are looking and have a lot of invested into alternative forms of energy, which are wind energy and solar energy, have become great financial boondoggles around the world. In California, they put out a huge, huge farm of solar panels to create energy and to release them from the addiction to oil and other things like that. They've cut back the production of oil by over 40% in California. They used to be self-sufficient in gasoline and oil and one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the world, and could be it again today, but they were having to rely upon other sources. They're having brownouts and even sometimes they're having failure of electrical systems. And it's really terrible, that people in the middle of summer can't get their air conditioners on because the electricity is down, or they have to ration the electrical flow and all those kinds of things. And so they create these huge solar farms. Well, they just closed it last year because it wasn't successful. And that's the thing I think is so crazy about all of this is that we've got plenty of evidence that this is a wrong direction to go, but also God is the one who controls the weather, not man. And I think that that really becomes evident in one of the accounts in Matthew chapter 8, where Jesus goes out on the lake with his disciples and he goes to sleep in the boat and tells them to go to the other side. And as they're going, a wind and a storm arises, and they do on the Sea of Galilee. They can rise very quickly because basically the Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level. And it has the Golan Heights, which are 5 and 6, all the way up to Mount Hermon, which is 9,000 feet, with all the cold air and the snow. That comes down, cold air goes down. It meets the warm air coming up from the south through the Jordan Valley, and suddenly winds begin to spin. The wave, you can get 10-foot waves on the Sea of Galilee sometimes. I've been on it once when we had to go on a really big boat because it was like being on the ocean in the middle of a storm. I did it just to have the experience, and I don't want to repeat it. But the whole point is that they're in this situation and they're saying to Jesus, wake up, don't you care that we're going to die? And Jesus wakes up and he looks at the storm, the wind and the waves, and he says, peace, be still. And suddenly it went calm. And his disciples said, what manner of person is this? It was one of those moments where they realized, yeah, we've seen him produce food, we've seen him heal lepers, and we've seen him do all these other miracles, but we've never seen somebody who can control the weather. And that's because he is God. God controls the weather. Oh, I'm not saying that we can't do things that abuse our climate. I'm not saying that we can be unnecessarily polluting. I think that we can neglect our God-given stewardship to care for the planet. But at the same time, to arrogate to ourselves the idea that somehow we can control the climate, that we can cause it to be colder in one part of the earth than another, and that's not going to have a reciprocal reaction in another way that would probably be negative, because we know that the climate tends to be self-regulating because God created it in perfect order and balance. And that's why even guys like Einstein said, the thing about our universe is that it is ordered. He wasn't about to say that God created it or God was the God of order, but he said it is an ordered universe. It's not disordered. He said the biggest mistake he made was when he used to theorize that the universe was eternal. It had always been here, always been here. And he said he just came to the realization it had to have a starting point. And the reason he finds it so amazing is the fact that the universe is an orderly universe. It's structured and it's held together. And what's one of the things that he says in Colossians to us? God says that he causes everything to consist. So the future isn't dependent upon whether I drive a gas-powered car or electric-powered car, or I drive no car at all and ride my bike. It's dependent upon the will of God. God told Israel, said, listen, if you're faithful to me, I'll bring you rains at the right time. Right after you plant, I'll bring the rains, and right before you harvest, I'll bring the rains so that you get a maximum yield of your fruits and vegetables and plants and grains. But, they didn't obey God, and so God said, if you don't obey me, what I'll do is I'll stop the winter rains. They won't come in their seasons, and everything will die. And basically what he's saying to them, you got to understand that you're not praying to the rain god, you're not praying to the storm god. That's what Baal was. You're praying the God of the universe who controls everything, who put the stars in the sky. And when man begins to self-idolize himself and arrogate to himself that he controls the weather or can control the weather, well, that's a fool's errand that you'll spend a lot of money on that could have been used in much more useful ways. And you'll probably do more damage than good in the long run. At least that's how I see it. God bless.